Hallo alles und gute Aten. Gute Aften. Yeah, I'm guessing that one's Dutch. But, it's 10 a.m.-ish, so time for .NET API review. And I have a bit less beard today. And yeah, so we have a red item, but we don't have the people to talk about it, so we're going to ignore that. And let's just see what we can get. As you can see from, hold on, I can get this right. There, we don't have that many people attending today. Hopefully we get more as time goes on, but we may have to end up calling things as we're not able to make progress.
At least there are two pretty faces, right? That's all that matters.
Endemo. There. No, that hand.
Yeah,
Ooh,
I have
backwards.
no idea.
Um, well, I get to look at the
There.
monitor of what's going out, but apparently I can't
Oh, I
handle
see.
right to left mirroring. So, okay. First up, runtime should support vector call, which is issue 8300.
Yeah, given that Tanner isn't here, we basically have two ways. We can either just approve it or tell him to come back. But I honestly think this is an easy one to approve because it's kind of exactly what we already have, right? There's all these types that are just used as mod obs or mod recs, right?
Yeah, well,
Um,
there's
We have both, right? We also have the inu, which is the alternative proposal, or the field on the inu.
an alternative. Well, if it's not on the top, we don't. Oh, yeah. Could be exposed on. Yeah.
But don't we normally have both? Like I'm
um,
just looking at the other calling conventions on source.net.
Well, because I know that the types are what they were moving to. So the interrupt services thing may be legacy. I mean, the fact
That
that
would
they
explain it.
proposed it as only as the new type means I think they want it. So the only feedback that I have is if we look at the Pascal casing here, capital call, capital conv, capital vector, and capital call. But when we added standard call and this call and fast call,
it's all
we
call
kept
conf.
those capital conv, capital call, capital conv, capital the name of the convention, and then it's flat case for the rest because we're just taking fast call as a word and then capitalizing it. So since it's vector call flat, for consistency, I think we want capital V here and lowercase c.
Oh, I mean the ones that are basically suffixed with call. I mean, there's some other ones with mixed casing, but I guess they're all.
But all the ones that end in the word call, the call is always lowercase. So we have
I guess that's true.
call
Yeah.
conv, capital fast, lowercase call, capital standard, lowercase call, capital this, lowercase call. So I'm just going with consistency with what we've named the other types.
That makes sense. Does anybody remember how this is expressed in C#? Like, what do you do? Is this do you put underscores in front of this? No, right? This is C++, right? I I've not marked p invokes with calling conventions in like 500 years.
I mean, I've used the attribute with the inu. I've never used the type directly, but looking at source.net, it's just type of as an argument to the attribute.
That's a forward.
Yeah, that's super helpful.
Yeah, not regarding the type words like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I see.
So
what does it? How can you have multiple calling conventions? Aren't they like mutually exclusive?
we probably had this discussion when they added the attribute, and they said there was probably some case where it made sense.
I guess. And then for function pointers, how does that work again?
I assume it's similar.
Well, I don't think you get to put attributes on function pointers, right? Because they're just types. So there would have to all be mod recs, mod opt somewhere in the signature, right? I thought there are like some special C# syntax that is more similar to C++, where you put a ton of keywords, and I think one of them accepts the type. I think, but I don't.
That could be. I'm not finding them on source linking.
Yeah, I don't know even what the. Yeah, I don't know actually. Yeah, I mean, modulo the naming suggestions you had, I think it makes sense. I mean, there's this question, of course, should be exposed to somewhere else. I mean, I assume there's some corresponding metadata entries in reflection that we need to expose. Maybe that is the one enum, but they are. I think there's also one in reflection metadata. Is there not? I thought there is.
Jeremy, do you happen to remember why we moved away from adding stuff to this calling convention inu, if in fact that's the case?
I don't.
Where is this enum exposed? Do you know? Like, who is actually? Is this reflection, or is this some?
So the only thing that
Here we go. Unmanaged function pointer. Isn't that the one?
Well, their alternative proposal was to put it on interrupt services.calling convention, and the only places that I see that are using it are passing it into a DLL import, and since DLL import is itself semi-deprecated, or at least no longer the way that we do things, I think that this just represents something about the old world, and there's something about using types makes it easier for them to extend their system or something. I don't know. They had a reason. I think it may also have to do with the fact that they wanted it to be multiple in the array. Or, sorry, in the attribute that they wanted multiple. I think that those two things kind of went together.
So yeah, then same question, like there is a reflection metadata one called signature calling convention. Do we have to add it there to round trip what happens when you compile?
If they do, we'll find out in a future API review.
Yeah, I mean, we can just ask it as a question in the end. If we can approve
Yeah,
it with
I
the
think
lowercase c. And
exactly. Like I think that's what I would do too. You don't have to block on it, but there's some core types where every time we add to them, there's like other places you have to keep in sync, and it's almost like we should put comments in the source code saying if you touch this other 5 things, right? That would be helpful.
copy, paste. Boom. Yay, we did something. We can all go home now. Alright, let's see if we have people to talk about this one. Collection marshal set count for list of T. 55217.
Yeah, so this is one of my areas here. I think the goal here is to have an API to resize the list. And this is in consideration of performance sensitive scenarios where you might want to retrieve a list as a span and make some modifications. And then, but currently there's no way to change the size of the span that you wish to modify, which is ultimately the data you wish to modify. So this API proposal is to have a public API to set a new size for a list, and I guess the alternative proposal here is to call this resize. Levi left a comment saying. Also to notice, this is currently under the collections marshal as sort of positioned as a low level performance API. There are a few considerations here around zeroing and like when you resize the list, there's cases where you have to clear the data and whatnot. I took a look at this shortly before this, so I would just say I'm aware of all the characteristics I have to consider. But yes, that's just like the general overview of what this issue goes over.
I think I missed the part where you explain how this actually works. So why I mean, how can we actually grow the list of t without invalidating the span?
It's.
Uh,
I think it's. So, I think the purpose, like they show here, is you have a list, and let's take the easy case, and the list hasn't grown to count yet. And basically, this is add range default of t for enough of them to make the count be high enough. And then the other direction is that you're calling, remove last n times until the count shrinks to the correct thing. And so it's just jumping through and letting you set count to be whatever you want, doing a right grow, or a right extend, or a right shrink as necessary.
If you scroll up, that's like a pseudo implementation. It's pretty small.
Yeah, I feel like it's probably the actual implementation, but yeah. Well, except it needs more curly braces.
Yeah, but that line there, right, where it says list.capacity equals count, right? Like that changes the array, no?
Right, so you don't get to call this after you grab the span, you call this before you grab the span.
The capacity setter is doing work, by the way, when it's doing list.capacity equals.
Right, because this would replace the array, which would invalidate the span.
Right.
Which is why the call is set count to grow it, and then call as span to get where you. Because the problem is if you call ensure capacity, that's going to give you the bigger, or use the bigger array internally, but it's not going to give you the span that corresponds to the full array. You'd still have to call add to add, 23, etc.
I think I'm still slow. Like, how is it different from the API that list of t currently has, where you just set capacity to whatever you want?
Set capacity will increase capacity, but not increase count. And when you call collection marshal as span of list, it only gives you from 0 to count.
And here you can set it less than length too, right? Which is another difference.
Mm.
Oh, so it's count versus capacity, really, not.
Right.
So
if the new count you want to set it to would exceed the capacity, then they're saying it would grow the array automatically, and if you're just shrinking it, then that's the same as calling remove last as many times until count drops to the right value.
Gotcha. So basically, set count is just meant as a way to increase the logical size to whatever random values there are, probably default, right? And then you basically say, like, I guarantee that I touch them up afterwards when I call as span.
Right. I mean, you can call, if you have a list event and you call, set count 100, you now have 100 zeros. If that's what you want, then great. And if not, you better fill it.
So presumably set count. I see. So set count actually will increase the capacity if necessary. So yeah.
I mean, it's either that or throw. It seems like it can just call grow for you if it needs to.
Yeah, it seems more logical, right? It seems a bit weird that it's kind of an orthogonal API, because the only way this API really makes sense is if you basically ask for the span and do something with it. So it almost seems like it should be combined with as span. I mean, as span is probably not the right name because it implies that it's cheap. But basically a method on collection marshal that would basically say, like, grow the list to whatever and then give me back the span seems a bit more logical, because otherwise it's API, right?
If the expected thing is essentially always to follow it with a call to as span, then we can change that void to return the span.
Yeah, I mean, or we could decide that we make it an actual public API and list of t, because there's really nothing wrong with it, right? It's just well defined. It would just mean that whatever difference between between old count and new count is, you just get default of t, right? I mean, it's not ill defined or
right.
a marshalling double API that.
Right. So yeah. So one piece of feedback that I was going to have is if we go with the shape as is suggested here, where the notion of the span doesn't come through in the API, I see no reason why it needs to go on collection marshal. It's just the same as calling add range with a default of with a enumerable dot count of the defaults, and the or calling remove last several times. So this is just a helper for moving the right marker of the array. If we do say everybody who wants to call this is going to immediately follow with calling as span, then I think it should stay on collection marshal, because we really don't want people actually grabbing the spans off of lists, because if you call set count on the list and give it a number, then grab the span and then call add, your span may now be invalidated. So it's a
it doesn't really have an equivalent for shrinking though, right? I mean, for growing, yes, you could call add range, but for shrinking, you have basically no way of
remove last, or if that doesn't exist, it's remove at count -1.
Right.
This
but
is
then if you do this
optimized,
in a
though.
loop, then it's not great because
but
you're
but
Yeah.
you can do this. You can do everything that this is saying right now. You just have to do it with in calls.
Right. That's my point.
Within, are we at the place that we need to throw an exception checks? And so it is giving you a bit better performance. It probably shows up significantly in a micro benchmark. It probably shows up almost not at all in a real application. Unless you do set count like a trillion. But
I may have to check whether my house is burning down right now because it smells like something is burning.
okay, we do have an
So,
air quality
this
warning,
is-
so it might be the forest.
It could
No,
be.
it smells like eggs that are burned. I
Oh,
think somebody's
okay.
cooking. Yeah, I think to me, I would just argue because everything is already public, it just does it in an inefficient way. I don't really see a reason why we can't just make the setter of count public and then just document the behavior.
This is for people using span, though.
Well,
like, for example, like
this
if you
line right
set
here is
count-
not about spans.
Yeah, that's kind of what I said earlier. But I mean, there's nothing really wrong with. I mean, as long as you document what the behavior of setting count is, so you just fill it with default of t. I mean, there's nothing wrong with the API. It's not that you get like uninitialized memory or anything like that, right?
Right.
No,
I mean,
not
yes,
when
the
you're
API makes
increasing
more
the size.
sense with span, but I've certainly had cases where I wish I could just index into the list of t and call the setter. Okay,
So I think the biggest danger reading this implementation is that if you set the count low and then didn't reuse it, then you're kind of like wasting memory, right? But maybe that's not a concern because, like, I don't know. But if the primary concern is for people who want to do something optimized using collection marshal as span on list and stuff like that, I could see why they want to hide it. Like, because yeah, my first inclination is like, this is a reasonable behavior for the count setter, and like that seems easy, because it is a reasonable behavior for the count setter. But yeah, the biggest risk, right,
Yeah.
is lowering the size.
Well, so list already has that. If you've called remove on a bunch of stuff, so you then, if you want to shrink the count and have it give up its now oversized array, you call trim excess.
no, that's capacity, right? It will not touch count.
Right, but I think Stefan's point was, your list grew to 1 million. You're
Mhm.
done with a bunch of stuff. You know that everything that you want is in the first 6 items, so now you say count equals 6. And he's like, oh, but the array is 1 million long because that's what capacity says. So, wow, that's wasteful. But that's an existing scenario on list of you've called remove on a bunch of stuff, and so now you call trim excess.
I see. Is there a remove range on list, or is there currently a way
There's
to?
There
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So it's not really that new. Yeah, as long as you just document it.
Yeah, so shrinking count is the same as calling remove range of the first index to pop off and then the remaining count. And adding would just add default of t. The only time that would get weird, now that we care about nullable reference semantics, is if you have a list of non-null string and you increase the count, then now nulls are popping in a place where you said that nulls wouldn't pop in.
Gotcha. That's actually a fair point. Yeah, that's where you may
But-
violate the type system.
Right. Well, but at the same time, like the runtime doesn't care. If you say list of string, you can pass null bang in add, and it'll be like okie
Right.
dokie.
But there's
Or-
no bang in this case. Like that is kind of a good point.
It would just yes. So you can get it in there in cases without bangs if you call into any libraries
Of
that
course.
haven't done their annotations yet, and you get the like, you told me it's not null, so I'll take your word on it.
Yeah, but something as fundamental as like if we add a list.count center, like I could start seeing like that's almost too easy to start sneaking nulls like accidentally in your non-nullable lists.
I would agree with that. I mean, basically, that you give people the, all the API calls compile, and then you have a hole, right? That seems unfortunate.
And do you think that's enough of a reason to say you need to, like, collections marshal says I'm doing something weird now, so I'm allowed to break the rules?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, that's to me what collection marshal says is basically like, here are places where you may violate the type system, so please read the fine print.
Okay. So now we're back to, once it's on collection marshal, do we think it should be void, or that obviously if you're calling it, the next thing you're going to do is grab the span, so we may as well combine those two calls for you? I mean, we can leave that as a suggestion.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's still available without using a span, right? Come to think of it, right? I mean, as I said earlier, like even if you don't use spans, you just want to index into the collection, it seems reasonable to just set the count to whatever and then just say, yeah, if they're defaults, I don't care because I know I'm going to write to it in the next step, right? It doesn't necessarily require you to use a span, but yeah, I think leaving it as proposed is probably fine.
Okay.
In YouTube, they've been suggesting resize. There are two people, but
Right.
I'm not sure I agree with it.
So I was about to say that. So that now that we've talked about what it does, there's the question of its name.
I mean, to me, that's not fundamentally different than setting capacity, right?
Right. Well, once it's living on collection marshal, do we think set count is the right name, or should it be?
That's what I'm saying.
Called
I mean,
resize?
if the public API, if we're okay in the public API to just set the capacity, right? Then having a method here that says set count seems logical, right? Because both of them will fundamentally change the dimensions of the underlying array potentially, depending on, what the arguments are, right? Relative to what the current size is. So in that sense, I wouldn't be opposed to resize, I guess, but like I think resize to me would imply that we somehow set capacity and count to the same value, I guess. Versus set count makes it clear it only affects count, and then it will increase capacity, but we may not decrease the capacity just because you set a smaller size, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think an interesting point is when we were talking about this, you said, why don't we just make count on list of t settable? And
Right.
so if we're doing this as effectively a detached property, then set count seems reasonable because it's being the proxy for the non-public set underscore count.
Right.
If we were adding it directly on the type, we would say with a name like set count, either make it the property as settable, or come up with a different name.
Yes.
Which would be where resize comes in.
Right. Like set count, because it's obviously associated, like, it could be the count setter if we didn't care about the null behavior. And then secondly, if I called resize 0, I would expect that to like clear out the array and replace it with array.empty. Like you could dock that it doesn't, but set count makes it more obvious that, like Emo was saying, the capacity isn't necessarily changing unless it needs to.
Yeah, which I think is the behavior that we want, but I don't think you want to pair them
Agreed.
up, right?
Right.
Yeah, I don't want to resize. I think that count is fine.
Right.
I mean, maybe resize is different. But...
The pseudo implementation here of if you've given us a number bigger than capacity, saying we're going to extend the capacity to work, I think that's fair. This is what's required to make count do that. Again, the only alternative is to throw, and
it almost seems like I should just call list of t ensure capacity. right? Because that's already baked in the policy of this if statement anyway, right? And probably more.
Yeah, I mean, like they may change the implementation here to just be list.ensure capacity count, and
yeah, that's my point, right? Because I think like there's probably some policy of like we don't probably set it to the exact value. We have some growth algorithm that doubles it or something like that, right? And I would just think that set count should have similar semantics, right? So that it just makes sense for users.
I'm actually curious.
It's not so much an observation of like what method it calls. It's more like what, how do we change the capacity? And we might actually do something naive there as well, but what we call grow. Grow does something non-trivial. Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, grow does. So ensure capacity does be a power of 2, and set capacity does be this answer. So
Plus protecting against bullshit. Yeah, I mean, yeah. So I think it makes sense for users of list of t because capacity and count are kind of like separate things, and just because you grow, just because you shrink one doesn't mean you shrink the other. So I think that kind of makes sense here as well. And then how we increase it, I think also makes sense if it's kind of similar or ideally identical. Then if you don't like it, well, you set capacity yourself, right? I mean, that's the benefit of having this as separate entities. Somebody, before you call set count, you just set it to somewhere, whatever value you want it to be set at.
right. Yeah, I think on their implementation notes, I think they've also helped justify collection Marshall over just making it a public member on the type, because where they say they don't want to go through the work of clearing the array. So if you have
it's reference types, yeah.
Right, reference types they want to do so they don't end up being a GC anchor, but like if you had a list of ints and you've had values and now you shrink the count with set count and then you grow it again, that's going to be the same answers that were there previously, unless somebody has called ensure capacity that caused the array to resize, in which case they're all 0 now. But they're not guaranteeing that when you increase size that what you'll get is default of t. What you get when you increase size is whatever happens to be there. So you better override it. Is, I think, the scenario, which kind of comes back to me of, if we're saying if you've increased the count, you better overwrite these values. It makes me wonder for the span, but you could write it with the indexers. So
yeah, I mean, my question is generally like, why do we care about reference types? I mean, the same argument holds. So you're not really having a type system problem there. It just means you better overwrite this slot, otherwise you root the object, which is not that bad of a bug to have, right? So if you care about performance, then I don't know why we would special case reference types.
Well, you want to special case reference types when shrinking, because if you don't overwrite it with null, then the list staying alive means that whatever is in unaddressable slot 117 is not subject to garbage collection yet.
Oh, for the shrinking case.
So yeah, this is remove the GC remove the reference to that object from this list so that it becomes eligible for garbage collection.
Yeah, clearly because
basically
you're not overwriting it with nulls. Yeah.
About time, right? Because it's important that if it regrows, you replace it, but that could happen way later.
Exactly, right.
Yeah.
And I mean, yeah, clearly when you shrink, you're basically making a statement that you're not going to set it, right? Because span will not give you access to the slot, right? So
right,
it does make sense to clear that. Yeah, by that. I'm not sure that there's that bad of a perf overhead than for non-reference types, but I can't be convinced either way.
Yeah, I mean, I know that there's prior art in some of the collections things for this. In fact, I think remove range does the same thing of, oh, I'm tracking references, I should clear them out, and oh, I'm tracking blittables, I don't care.
Okay. Fair enough.
But yes, it's one of those like Does this really matter to your benchmark? Okay, so
This was a good API proposal. It was interesting.
so we think set count is right. List and count are good names for it.
I believe so, yeah.
I think ensure count would mean it can't shrink, so I don't think we should call it ensure.
I agree. Ensure count to me implies that it's growing only.
Yeah. And yeah.
I mean, it depends on what the desired behavior is, right? If people think that shrinking is not important, then having an alternative with ensure count would make sense. But it seems the API would be more versatile if it can both grow and shrink.
Yeah. Again, I mean, shrinking could be done with the existing call to remove range.
Yes. Yeah, I guess when it comes to like special marshalling APIs, I think I'm more a fan of Swiss Army knife semantics rather than something super narrow, unless it has terrible semantics. But the semantics here seems well defined. Especially because if you have bugs, it's pretty easily observable. It's like, my collection's not as big as I thought it would be. Oh, because I accidentally shrunk it over here.
Do we really think ensure capacity would be better? I feel like in most scenarios, set count, you're gonna like not be likely to go past it anytime soon.
I mean, it's a question of what do we think that the API is mimicking? Like when shrinking, it's not going to call trim or trim excess. So is it weird that you're going to lose your multiple of 2 if you called set count and it grew versus if you had already been in that boundary? Like, because it's not actually power of 2, it's double what you currently have. It just starts off as a power of 2. So like it feels like it'll be weird if you call set count 17 and then that becomes your new basis of growth. Whereas if you're 16, you stay sort of power of 2 aligned. 17, you get prime chunking, and so that's why I said maybe better. Partial, get rid of that. All right. I think that's everything we talked about. We thought about putting on list, but nullable reference types. We said set counts better than resize. Dropped the implementation note about ensure capacity, and with only 5 of us on the call, whether void or span is the better return type is a thing for them to think about.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if we have to write it now, but I think you're ultimately right that the point about non-reference types potentially being non-zero when you increase count is probably even the bigger reason not to make it like the public setter.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, if we made it a public setter, then we'd probably tell them they have to take the hit at some point of clearing out the space. Like, just get rid of the if it's reference type and just make it always blast out the range. But
I see. But then, yeah.
I guess that would mean they'd have to actually call clear on grow, because list itself would have not been clearing things on the basis that you could only increase the size by calling add and giving it a positive value. So for the perf they want, yeah, I guess. Also, back in English. All right. Add a BitArray dot contains 729999er.
Well, this one is maybe a little simpler in the sense. The goal here is to have an API that tells whether all values in the bit array are set to either true or false. So the API says contains. There is an alternate proposal that says should we call it all bits set. Just saying like all the bits in this area are set to true or false. And I think that's basically it for the proposal. I mean, so this is supposed to be like an optimal API as opposed to what currently exists, where you cast it and then call it contains on. I mean, on the returned boolean.
Yeah, because certainly contains boolean that's our any bit set. So contains true would be not all bit 0, and contains false would be not all bits true. So you could still get the all behavior out of this, but that like if the
Yeah, you would call all or any, right?
Yeah, if the idea is to express all or any, then you want all or any, not contains.
Yeah, I think Eric was proposing contains because it's a collection, but I don't know if I agree with that.
So BitArray is the one where it's an arbitrary number of bits, right? It's not limited to 32, right?
I'm not sure.
I think BitArray is the one where we basically take the number of bits divided by, I don't know, 32 or whatever, and then have an underlying array of ints serving as the.
Yeah, there's an array, not just a field.
Yeah, it's an okay. So basically, we have an arbitrary number of bits. So bit masks are not great with placement for that, because then you have to like create some really large ones.
Yeah, so I mean, if contains is what's desired, then you can have contains. But if what's
contains would imply any, right? I mean, contain would basically say are any bits set? Which,
right.
I mean, is a logical thing to ask, I guess, but
right, because he doesn't. In the write-up, there's not a clarification, like, because what this will say is not all bits false.
Yes.
Yeah, this is.
But the writer specifically says to
to
check if all flags within the array are either set or unset. That to me is not what contains would do. Contains true or contains false would just say is any bit set or is any bit unset.
Further down, where we compare programming languages. There we go. Because, like, I'm inclined to think this probably is two methods than a single method with a bool, just like in general. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess it depends on your view. I think the methods as proposed are fine. I even think contains would be fine. Because, I mean, if you treat it as a collection of bools, then you know, contains with a bool makes sense, right? Which is kind of what BitArray is supposed to be doing, right? But I'm also okay with saying we don't call it contains, we just have all or any, which seems reasonable.
Right.
So I'll admit I haven't used the BitArray APIs a lot. Do the BitArray APIs take and return bools a lot, like for individual bits?
There is an indexer that, given an index, gives you back a bool. And then there's a count, which is the number of bits, right, or the number of bools.
Sure.
But there's no add or remove because it's an array, so there's no growing or shrinking it.
All right, but the indexer is bool. Okay, good to know.
I think you can grow it by just referencing a bit beyond count.
No, come on, that was terrible. Would do that.
I think if you're just like BitArray sub, 900.
Please tell me that this is not the behavior.
If index is bigger than length throw. Okay.
Okay, so sanity.
I will say that, like, with contains, I was never, I guess, too in doubt of what it does, right? Like, I don't think it's easy to misinterpret.
Well, the same can be said about any or all,
Yeah,
right?
I know. But...
I'm honestly okay with any and all, given that the shape of the type is not standard collection, right? If it would have add or remove, then I think contains would make a lot more sense. Given that it doesn't really, and has very specialized APIs like and or and not already, I think it's fine to just say we don't do contains, we just do any and all, so you can ask the right question.
Yeah, because I think we have, two possible shapes.
But not with those terribly long names, right?
I mean,
what to say.
We can come up with the shorter names if they're properties, but I don't think we want them to be properties. I guess I don't know how expensive the computation is, but properties are supposed to be field fast, and I don't think that they can guarantee field fast.
I guess, yeah, you're right, in the sense that why do we have two methods that take an argument if we could just have two dedicated methods where we don't have to compare it to any values, we can just do the computation directly.
Yeah.
I think I would
seem
honestly
simpler
say
to
something
the
like
argument.
any bit set or all bit set, rather than set and clear.
So
I think
you want,
any or all in the name, I think, would be good.
So you want all in any, and so it's all 0 is not any. I mean,
I honestly like all and any straight up. Use dot comments. What else does it mean?
Yeah, I think that's probably also fair. I think that's.
So
I mean, it might be useful to have an API like 0 if you actually want to compare to 0, which is not probably unreasonable.
That's fair. So a method called all violates our rules. There's no verb in it. All methods are verbs or verb phrases. Properties are noun phrases, methods are verb phrases.
I think the only counter to that is that we already have a mainline API that uses that naming convention.
On link.
Yeah.
Which is all extension methods, which means it's already a bit weird.
Well, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that it's something that people use a lot, right? So it's not like something we just cooked up out of thin air.
But we have we have on collections is empty, not any or we don't call that state any or none. We call it is empty. I was like we can invent paradigm here, but I think aside from link, we don't have any methods named all.
I think that's fair. I mean,
Link does operate mostly on collections, so it seems like it will be a natural. The collections would be a natural place to start with any or all.
Right. So, but I mean, my point is, it violates our naming guidelines. So we don't need to
Yeah.
we should be way more. This is the perfect name. We absolutely should do it, and we should start changing our guidelines instead of, well, Link did it, and it's a shorter name. Like our guidelines explicitly say, don't pick a shorter name just because it's shorter. It's
Yeah, that wouldn't be my rationale. My rationale would be it's used in the same domain, so it makes sense that you align the names with the existing domain if it's widely used, right? If it's super fringe, I'm also fine with ignoring it, but I wouldn't call Link super fringe. I think it's used very heavily by people in practice. But I think I can also be convinced that, BitArray isn't really a collection. I mean, you use it as one, but basically people use it as an efficient, unbounded bit vector, right? Which I think that seems.
If we keep the if we stick to the existing guidelines, do we need the R prefixes?
so again, it's a question of if it's a property or if it's a method. If it's a method, you need a verb, and the only verb in this is R. So you need it.
Yeah, I think I would not make it a method. I would not make it a property. I mean, clearly this thing has to go over the entire collection, right?
Or they increase their storage cost by keeping this data around.
Sure.
But assuming a large bit array and that they don't add special field for tracking, being in the I'm all clear or all set state, then it's going to be O in walk, where in is count divided by 32. But so assuming that we're saying it's not field fast, it shouldn't be a property, and once it shouldn't be a property, it needs a verb. And right now, thanks code. That is the verb. I mean, R can be has. That's also a verb, but
For some reason, I like it more with is than with are, but probably not correct.
I mean, is all bit set is wrong.
Is there any bit set is good?
That because that's ist instead of sein. Like, it's just wrong.
It makes sense for the other one though.
I think if you read it as an if statement, I think probably has reads better than are.
If array has all bit set, that's fair.
Yeah. Which is, I think, the way you would use it, right?
I mean, we can also avoid the long name by going with contains and saying that contains is basically not the thing you were asking about. Again, the proposal said it wanted to know if they're all set or all clear, and then proposed contains. But contains answers the opposite question. Contains true is they're not all clear, and contains false is they're not all set.
Like, is empty and is full technically meets our guidelines, right?
Is a verb. Yeah.
Okay. So
it's just that is
you're saying yes
when you have a plural, right?
Agreed. Like, so I feel like, if we're picking a worst, yeah, I don't know. Like,
I think this one reads fine, right? I mean, if array dot has all bit set is pretty hard to misunderstand, right?
This is my favorite of the rest. I like it better than is as well.
Yeah.
I
think especially with Booleans, I really hate Boolean APIs where 90% of the call sites have to negate one part of it, because then it really becomes a Yoda-esque API where you always have to put yourself into the opposite mindset to understand what questions it actually answers, right?
Right, but yeah. I mean, there's three things that somebody might want to know. And we can decide if we want 1, 2, or three methods to answer this. It's, are they all 0?
Mhm.
Are they all 1? And are they neither of those? So
Yeah.
the contains can tell you they're all not the thing you asked for. The has all answers one of those questions. Has any says it's not 0. And if you want to know 0, now you're negating not has any. I guess if you want to know if it's in a mixed state, you actually have to answer multiple things. So has all and has any probably will read the best and gets to avoid has all bits set versus has all bits clear. But
I mean, adding the third one has no bit set, I think probably is also fine. Because I mean, realistically, these are the 3 questions you actually ask, right? And then you never have to negate anything.
right, is nothing true? Is anything true? Is everything true?
Yeah.
I mean, you may also have the is something not true?
Oh.
I guess, but I think if you use this BitArray thing, I think it would be weird to ask the opposite.
Well,
I don't know.
yeah. Well, and right now you can get is something not true by has any is true and has all is not true.
Right, but then it's probably more expensive than having one dedicated API that does it.
I guess,
I
but
mean,
I'm just thinking you may end up with implementations of if they're all set, I have a special I already know the answer. We can move on and don't have to do incremental work. And then if any are set, well, now I know you're not clear because 0 was also a special case that I knew I didn't need to do any work, and now I need to do great, what's the work I need to do? So I think that has any and has all are expressing all the cases.
But now if you want to do has no bit set, you have to call both APIs, right?
Has no bit set is just not has any. Has at least one true
sorry,
and at
yeah.
least one false
Of
does
course.
require
Of course.
has
Yes.
any and not has all.
See, Boolean APIs are hard.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
but-
interesting looking at the existing BitArray API and seeing how non-verby it is. It's the name of the operations, right? It's right shift and left shift instead of shift left and shift
Right,
right.
but shift
they're
is
all
still a
nouns.
verb. No, shift is a verb.
It's the second thing, right?
I
if it was
Didn't say it has
shift,
to start with a verb. I said it has to be a verb phrase.
Mm. But
But how do you
it's,
call the
it's
other
not
APIs like and
not
or
exist, right? It's not really that different from all or any.
I think for and or not, I think to me it's kind of like it's kind of like an operator, right?
Yeah, they're using not as
It is an
negate.
operator, clearly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
That one should have been called
But
negate.
it's the name of the operator. Yeah, it's a noun.
Right, but we don't have an any operator. If we had an op any, then we could talk about having a method named any, but we don't. We have an operator named not. It's the bang or the tilde, depending on your opinions.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I think the APIs proposed here seems fine. I mean, I
Which one do we prefer, contains or the has APIs?
and if you really want to make it shorter, I would be okay with removing bit set, right? Has all, has any. I think that also is pretty clear what you're checking for, right? But if it's really length that we are concerned about, but
I'm not as much. I mean, at the point where we start with has all, you might as well finish the phrase.
Yeah. I mean, it feels just a little. I can get it from an abstract collection sense. I mean, granted, has all makes no sense on an abstract collection. You need to know what all would actually mean, but I feel like if I just saw if vector dot has all, I'd be like, has all what? Like you left me hanging. It's like has all the bits set. Oh, yeah. Why didn't you just tell me that? Or we can go with contains. I think that the initial description here, contains, is you need to twist your brain around to make it work for that question you're trying to answer. Yeah, doesn't appear to have an efficient way to check if all flags are set or unset. And yes, this would be the opposite of an efficient implementation.
You mean because of the argument? I mean, I think Tanner's argument would be we can probably inline that.
Oh, I mean the using link to.
Oh yeah, the link one, of course.
Yeah.
That's almost like a study in how expensive can we make this call.
Right. But his comment, there doesn't appear to be an efficient way. The only suggested workaround I found is to use link. And it's like, well, that's certainly not an efficient way, but it is a way.
Yeah, a hand-rolled follow would still be better.
Yeah. Yeah. So. I don't think we want to do both. So we can say it's fine as is, or we can say the longer names are more expressive of the behavior that people want. Chat says they think that contains is more consistent with other APIs. I think in this one domain, you're always asking the opposite question that you want. Because to go back for I've special cased everything is set and I've special cased everything is clear, you have if it contains false, or if it doesn't contain false, then everything's set, so use that special case. And now if it doesn't contain true, everything is clear, so do that special case, and otherwise start walking the data. Which means that you need to negate the answer and negate the input to get the thing that you're thinking about.
Exactly. This is the reason why I hate the proposal. It's like it takes me mental effort to parse it every time, and I guarantee you, it takes me 2 attempts, or probably more like the USB style, 3 attempts to get it right.
Yeah, because the question you're asking then is if it doesn't contain false, and you're like, okay, doesn't contain. Oh, everything is true, and so.
Yes.
Yeah, you're right. You're thinking about what are all the bits.
Yeah, I mean we can also. But that seems weird.
But everything. It's not a verb. It's a verb phrase. I know.
Everything is true. Yeah. Is the verb. Alright, so Emo, you like the has any, has all?
Yeah.
Naomi?
Yeah, I'm cool with that. Oh, do we talk about bits versus bits for has any bits set? Bits. I don't know whether I have my grammar right, but it seems like bits is like a singular bit is more appropriate.
For any, so has any
For
bit.
any has any bit set. But
Does the
isn't
parking
that
lot
taking
have
the
any
first one?
car? Does the parking lot have any cars? No, it needs to be a plural. My English neural network says it has to be a plural after any.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's like, does the parking lot have any car idling, or does the parking lot have any cars idling? Honestly, I think both are okay, because like it's not just any car or any cars, right? It's also like, I don't know, something describing them. They might be arguably asking different questions, right? Because one might have a minimum of 2. Like, does the parking lot have any car in it, or does the parking lot have any cars in it?
Yeah, at least having one bit or one car like is relevant to me. I mean, It's like one is
Uh,
sufficient to answer. One or like one, yeah, one, just one instance is sufficient to answer the question.
Yeah.
it's
So
kind of weird. It's kind of based on the expectation. It's like if you expect there to only be 1 or 0, then you would ask for, you know what I mean? You would ask, does the parking, or you might ask, does the driveway have any car in it,
yeah, but
right?
you would ask, have we had any customers today? You wouldn't ask, have we had any customer today? Like,
I think you're right. Yeah, but if you expect there to be like generally a lot potentially, like you would ask the plural even if one is sufficient.
yeah, because you're asking. Yeah, I think it's a plural question, and if you wanted, does the parking lot have at least 2 cars idling in it? Now you would say at least,
But we wouldn't have to answer
or
this
you would
question
ask
if we
more than
named it.
one, which is what you're really asking there. So chat has proposed has any taking a value and has all taking a value.
Mm.
It's a good compromise.
And I think if I were to read that, you get
Are there like other types that would make sense if we like in has any overload? Like, can this be general? Like, is it are there scenarios where generalizing it makes sense? So that is.
I didn't follow the question.
I was wondering if there are any other types. Like we have for has any personable and has all personable. Are there other like T's that could be passed to these methods where it would make sense? I guess maybe that's just some background research for me. But
Right. Well, because the link version, any and all, you have to give it a predicate. And in this case, we
If
can collapse the predicate because we know the the true or falseness comes from the value itself.
I see.
so, I mean, has any is contains in this world, right? And then we also added has all because like that's the question that you're usually asking. So you don't have to like contort your brain or whatever. I mean, they're trivially rewritable in terms of each other, right? So you don't really, well, I say trivially, but it's like a not, right? Like on the parameter.
Right. Well, again, because has any is not has all not value,
Mhm.
and that's so implementation wise, you really only have to implement one of them. You might implement both, and like I think they're okay. I also think that we can get away with the zero arg versions.
Yeah.
I don't have strong feelings.
I would honestly only have the zero arcs version because I don't think you ever have a case where the bool would be a non-literal, right?
Right.
I don't think there's so in that sense I think I actually prefer it without the bool because I think it's easier to read. I would probably remove the word bits and just call it has all set, has any set. That also avoids the plural discussion from earlier.
Fair enough.
Yeah. That's clear enough. It's like any what? It's like any bits. Obviously, you're working on a bit array. Um,
And I think that actually reads really nicely. If array dot has all set. Because the other problem with literals is like you have coworkers that do crazy shit, right? They negate the call, they pass in false, and it's like, Jesus, now I have to think about what this thing does. And by coworker, I really mean past yourself, right? Well, it's clear at the time I wrote it.
All right, we good?
If we, yeah, I think we are good. And I think
Cool.
not has any set, I think is a great way to ask for no bit set.
Yeah, I think that reads fine. If not data has any set, then you're like, okay, I know what that means. I think that you know what that means better than if not contains true.
The only trouble with this
Yeah.
API, I think, is that it's kind of the special case of zero, right? Like if the collection itself is empty, right? What semantics do you want to get out of it? That's the same problem with links all in any. But that depends on the question you're trying to answer, right?
Right. Well, I mean, yeah, you get the same thing if we had the has none set, or sorry, has all clear. Has all clear
Yeah.
would be, can you say true with zero, or has none set is true at zero? I think everyone can agree on that. Yeah. AKA exercise left to the reader.
Wait. So it's an interesting point about count zero because contains has a very clear behavior in that case. Like, and I think we didn't consider that when deciding between the two APIs. Like, it's easy to say, oh, that requires some thought, but like that requires some thought in API design as well, right? Like, contains is obvious in this case; it's false for both parameters.
Yes.
I'm not sure actually. Do we know? Like, we should think. Like, what's the behavior that we would want for zero and has all set and has any set?
I mean, at zero, I think that has if we took has any set and has none set, I think we would at zero we would agree that none is true. This array has nothing that is set. It has nothing, so it has nothing that is set. And I think that any is not none.
Exactly. So I think this matches link's behavior as well.
So at zero, these both return false.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. I do think that's clear enough.
Count
I
equals
just
zero.
wanted to think about it.
Almost certainly.
So it's just like contains, basically. It always returns false in the zero case for both.
Yeah.
Yes.
And if we had has none, then that one will return true at zero, because it's not any.
All right, I'm good. I'm just glad we thought about it.
Took away the notion of it being an exercise left to the reader. How are we doing on time?
40 minutes to go.
We're being fast. I guess that's the benefit of not having anyone here, is we don't have very long debates. All right. Consider adding unmanaged pointer overloads to the Marshall API's 75630. Is this that we bounced it back, or is this the bigger version?
I believe so. So last time I have a comment where we basically only had the pointer to string NC1 and we said, are there any other ones to look at? And I think Aaron did a pass, and that's the result of that. Because he edited. So this is all the ones where it would make sense to have pointer overloads.
You can have a void star array? I mean, I guess.
Yeah, I did not know that either.
I mean, they're just numbers, so.
What?
I guess it makes sense. It hurts my brain to see it.
Yeah, I think I never wanted that. There were cases where I wanted to instantiate a generic with void star, though. That has happened.
Yeah, there's something about that syntax is just hurting my head. I mean, pretty sure it's legal C syntax as well.
Well, and C brackets is just fancy way to say star anyway, right? But
It changes the way your initializer works, but yeah.
even in C, I thought it's a C++ thing.
Well, when you're declaring it, because you can say, I think
if you put
you
a
can
number
say,
there,
yeah,
sure,
I think
yeah.
you can put a number in it, and now it's like if it's a stack variable, it's make it that big on the stack.
Right. But I think without a number, I think it's just the same as star and C. It just means you get 2.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, looks good, I guess.
Yeah. Assuming that these are all just taking a thing that we currently have int pitter and is overloading it to say void star instead of int pitter.
Yeah, I think all the ones that are weirdly named, like int OFS or len, right? I think that's just the original naming of those methods. At least that's what spot checking revealed.
Yeah.
And they're Marshall APIs, so nobody's...
Right, because, pitter to string uni, like, well, clearly it takes a pitter. Otherwise, what was the pitter? Yeah, I guess, so assuming that the void star array compiles, it seems.
I mean, I think maybe read int pitter. I don't know what that's doing, because that returns a void star.
It's reading a pointer-sized value from the pointer.
Okay, is that actually? It's not like following a reference. It's not dereferencing or anything. Is it just an identity? Am I misunderstanding that?
Well, it's read int 64 on a 64-bit system and read int 32 on a 32-bit system. Or that you have a void star star and you want to read what's the first void star out of it.
Okay, so it is dereferencing.
I mean, it's a bit weird that a read int PTR returns a void star, though. It makes sense that it accepts one, but I would expect it to return it, an int PTR or whatever we have called it.
It's the opposite, right? Like, I think it's just rough translation. Oh no, it exists in int pitter to int pitter, so it's dereferencing.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, right. So this read int PTR, the one that doesn't take an offset, is in C terms, it's just star PTR.
Right.
So,
right. Or index 0.
Right. So dereference this and give what's there, and what's there is a void star.
All right. I just wasn't clear whether it was identity function or dereferencing, and since it's dereferencing, it makes sense.
Right. It's
not the same
dereferencing
as
the source.
dereferencing,
It's
right?
not dereferencing
because it depends
output.
on.
If this is null, you'll get a null reference, or if this is null, you'll get an AV.
Right.
Because it's reading through PTR to give what is the register-sized value, or what is the pointer-sized value stored at that destination.
Right.
So it's dereferencing PTR. But I agree, Emo, we should probably say read int PTR returns int PTR.
Yeah, or nint, right, which is the same now, but...
And then you can do the as pointer.
Right.
Because I agree, it seems weird that read int PTR is not reading an int PTR.
Yeah, and if we really wanted one that returns void star, I mean, we could have one. I would just call this read pointer at that point, right? But
and then we'd say
at that point
we shouldn't add it because right, because the argument here is if you're already working in pointers, that you need to do the new int PTR of your syntax to call these methods. It's right. Like, I just want you to read a byte. Now, granted, once you're already working with pointers, you could just cast your void star to byte star and dereference it, but which I guess is also where this gets weird. We said to add all these, but many of them are, if you're really working with pointers, are you even going to call these?
Well, I mean, the ones that do literally like read byte or read in16, probably not. But the other ones are actually doing real work, right? Where they
Right.
have some
So
weird semantics.
the pointers to strings where that's running through a string encoding, those are doing work. The get unique object for I unknown, sure. Here's your P unknown. We're doing the com stuff. That's fine. But yeah, I think the reads and the writes, I think we would get literally 0 calls to them.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it does seem awfully redundant. Like, yeah, it's not the identity function, but it's trivially expressible in any unsafe context where you could use this.
Right. It's once you have a void star that you were going to pass in, read int 64 is you just cast that to an int 64 star and then do star cast pointer. You're not going to call Marshall.
Or use the dereference operator or whatever.
Yeah, it makes sense for in PTRs because there's no syntax to do that, right? But for regular pointers, it seems indeed tedious.
Yeah. So I think we want to drop all the reads and all the writes.
Yeah, I would agree with that. They seem obvious. Oh god, some of them are just horrible. We should have called offset instead of OFS. We should have called OFFS. That seems more in line with the emotion I have.
Okay. Alright, so I just deleted everything that started with read and write out of his proposal. I guess I should double check that they were all primitives. Yep. The colorizer questions the legality of that, but if it's illegal, he can't add it, so that's fine.
Sorry, I was trying to figure out if structure to pointer makes sense or if that was also just an easy cast. And
structure to pointer does work if the structure contains a string, I think. There. I mean, I guess it isn't the same as at struct because it's writing it to a destination, but.
So what was that?
My comment of if it's literally the same as address of struct, but it's so that's. I think that would be the syntax.
Yeah, looking quickly in source.net, it seems to be doing more than that, but yeah.
Yeah, that was my recollection, is that you can have a struct that has strings in it, and it does the Windows general convention of nestling them at the end of. So doing a pointer to just after the struct, and then writing the string, and then if there's a second one, then it's right after the first string, and so on. So. But. All right. And loop. Oh, right, it's foggy. I assume my microphone's not picking up the foghorn, but I hear it in this room. Alrighty. Emo, I assume you skipped this. The collection does not support ranges.
Yeah, like I'm still trying to find the actual owners, and they don't respond to my emails, which is not great.
Should we mark this one as needs work because we're waiting on feedback? Just to get it off our list.
So I don't want to. Yeah, I mean the reason I haven't touched
this
it
is you don't want to edit
every
it.
time.
Okay.
Yes, because then whoever edits it gets a public flogging.
Obsolete the outdated VB API.
I think that is in the similar vein, but yeah.
Question: is the order based on like when was it added, or first? Like when was it last? Or
yeah, you're asking. So I think the ideal would be we should order it by the time it got marked ready for review, but that's not what you see. What you get is the order in which the issue was created.
oh,
And that is also why things sometimes sneak into the middle, because somebody marks an issue later that is 4 years old, right? And then they just pop it to the top of the list.
So milestone is the first key. Well, sorry, I guess blocking, then milestone, then opened date, which is essentially issue number, but we pull in multiple repositories, so it's open date. If you've joined because there's one that you care about, Miriam, you can suggest one.
I have one that's it should be pretty easy. It's the fourth last one on the screen: generic object factory and activator utility.
Yeah, since this one's marked as future, it was
Oh, was it future? Oh.
That we'll never get to it, but we can talk about it first.
So it's basically just the API addition because we have create instance, both like the both types of create instance that you pass in the type, or like you have a generic create instance with like the type that you provide. So it's just one additional API that makes sense to add. That was missing in the list already.
So this will be a new generic delegate type.
Yeah.
The object factory of T.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Which is exactly like object factory, but it returns T instead of object.
Yeah, the idea is that not to cast it once you get it.
Meaning the proposal's missing declaring a new type called object factory of T?
Right. And I'm curious whether you'd want more generic parameters for the arguments. Can that be? Because like right now, it's like, do we want that to only be expressible through the type array?
Yeah, I assume the T version is just going to change what the return type is.
Right. And like, I'm curious whether or not like it makes sense to add any generic parameters for the arguments. Might actually be somewhat nice for performance if they're value types.
So because it would be an array of arguments types. It would be an array of argument types.
Well, this proposal, right, which only has one generic parameter. I'm just pointing out that you could have another proposal that had like, more generic parameters for the arguments as well.
What would they represent?
The argument types.
I think he wants create factory of like T1 through 3 that looks exactly like it makes func of T1 through 3, except gives the special extra iService provider argument. At which point, honestly, just use func.
Yeah, I mean that's a valid point.
So
yeah,
what's...
I mean, I think I don't understand like what's the usage of it, right? Because the existing object factory seems to be used in contexts where you don't know the types. So I don't know how you make that generic work really.
Oh, you usually do know the instant type, right? Like it's literally the first argument. Like and oftentimes that is known up front, like even in like statically at compile time.
Yeah, I mean,
like
maybe I'm
it's
not
like create
using it.
instance. Yeah. No. Okay. So I mean, maybe we're overcomplicating this, or I'm overcomplicating this because to your original point, Miriam, like create instance already has this with one generic parameter. We're only trying to get parity with that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, the first one that I jumped to of finding it here. Oh, this one can't use it.
That's kind of what I mean. It's like, because to me, this guy is used in infrastructure where you don't know enough to make it generic usable, right? Like I would really hope that things at the bottom of this thing don't go through this interface to begin with, right? They would, through activator utilities or object factory, right?
I mean,
I'm assuming in like application usage, we're looking at here at like the source code here, but like application users, they would know then if their type.
I see usages in MVC right now, like where the type's known up front, and like in routing, like the filter types.
I guess
Like
that we just added.
I guess this
for
one
endpoint
does.
filters.
So
there's quite a few.
So where it's passing t-tag helper and then hard casting t-tag helper.
Yeah.
You also know you probably know the types of the arguments then as well, right?
Well, in this case, it knows that there were no arguments.
Sure, but that is a form of knowing the arguments.
But then you don't need the optimization either. But yeah. So I see like one case where there's a single argument that we always know up front. But I don't want like to overcomplicate this necessarily. Like I think
it might be a special case. I don't know. Would it be? Like, what is that case?
so. I mean, one example is see if I can get a good link to it.
Like, is there anything special that this is doing that's not just being, func? I assume this is actually doing work in binding a thing inside the DI system.
I mean, object factory is literally just a delegate, so it could be. I mean, it's just bound to some function, right? So there's no reason why it couldn't be a func, except that it takes two arguments, right, and returns an argument. So like the func of, 3 arguments is somewhat unreal.
Because this
so
one.
We use it.
Go ahead, Stefan.
Sorry. Yeah. So the reason we use it is like in this case we're like type activating a filter. So the filter wants some context, right, which isn't a service, but it's something that you might want to accept in the constructor. But then you might also want services. And you don't even necessarily, my understanding of the behavior is like the way we call it, right? Like if you scroll down, there's another call, create factory with empty types, is like it's optional. Like you don't even necessarily need to take like, oh, maybe you're looking not at my link, you're looking at something else. But basically, yeah, it's used for user specified types, right? When we want to give like additional context in addition to allowing you to inject services. Not a use case. Does that make sense? And then oftentimes, like application developers will specify their own type as a generic parameter, right? So
right. Well, because what the call that I found here is doing, like, it would be best served by, yes, this one taking two generics and returning, func of iService provider, HTTP client, T client.
say that again. Sorry.
This particular call on screen, they know the input type, they know the output type, and then there's the one parameter that you give them for free. So this line would benefit from a version of create factory that returned func of iService thingy, comma, HTTP client, comma, T client. That's all they want. And then it's a strongly typed delegate that gives them exactly the go make me a T client given a context and an HTTP client. And because that's, how they're casting it, they're calling, new object array on every call that has to come in.
So the point is, these are user types that it can inject services, right? Like, so sorry, how would they get the services? Like via these user types with your suggestion?
No, like, but the way that they're calling it here is all that they would want if it returned. Where's my notes over here? Yes, boat, I hear you. Shut up. Also, I'm not on the water, so I have a skewed opinion. Sorry, the foghorn that I can hear is annoying me. So the call that they have, they're calling create factory. So if this gave them, activator func of iService provider, assuming that's what it's called, HTTP client, T client. And you'd have to decide on the order that you want here, but going in the order that they're currently passing things, like, that's what they want. So that when they call it, they just say delegate of services and HTTP client.
Like, I agree with you. Yeah, I mean, that's why I made the point about adding, extra generic parameters for, like, the argument types that you're going to be passing in. So I mean, your point is like, why define a delegate type when func exists? Like,
I mean, so for one, we have the rule that says don't define delegate types if func makes sense. But the question is really, is adding just the I know the T return, is that useful enough that it's worth creating a new type for, worth creating a new method for, like, or should this be? There's a real scenario around all of the types. Let's optimize it for some reasonable number of types. And then if we think in addition to that, there's useful for the, object bracket, like, I don't know, give me some arguments here, then we can. Or if we think we'd end up there anyway, we can accept this and say, but, consider finishing the proposal.
I agree. I mean, I brought that up, right? Like, about making the generic parameter types. I was trying to stop myself from, like, making perfect the enemy of good, because there's the equivalent in create instance where there's only one generic parameter. Because what you said about generic parameter to create factory applies just as much to create instance, right? Like, you could also have, like, the HP client, like, if that was using create instance.
So I feel that if activator utilities had been designed through the API review process, we would never have added the object factory delegate.
Yeah.
We would just say it's func of object and object bracket bracket. Sorry, of iService provider and object bracket bracket to object. There's no ambiguity in the delegate. That having the type name doesn't help. You don't need to, like, there's no ambiguous parameters. And now we have the, do we add a new delegate type just to specify the T, or for symmetry, or do we return func here? And so this one is harder than the one that doesn't require creating a new type.
Fair. Yeah, and like I'm with you. Like no new delegate types. I don't think we need consistency with like the kind of object factory. Like we can just admit that that is against our guidelines, and I don't think it's a problem to start returning func from the new overloads, right?
I mean, my question is kind of like if there's some effort to make DI more source generator friendly, right? So I could see if we go down that path, then we may want some different API shapes for these things. But then I also don't think the proposal is actually cutting it due to the type arguments.
Sure, but like, yeah, I mean, I would like more type arguments as well, I guess.
I'm not sure that I follow you.
What I'm saying is like, I mean, there's people that I think like Fowler, other people looked at how to make DI possible as a source generator. And like, I think once you go down that path, you don't want APIs that take type or object, right? You want something that is a bit more typed so you can actually generate it out. And so I could see us adding APIs to support that, but I don't think the proposal as it's here is super helpful for that scenario due to the type arguments.
Isn't there some way to like attribute a type array argument? So if you pass in like type literals, the trimmer is still aware of it. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm just imagining.
Well, there's annotations. Like, if you look at the existing create factory ones, it basically says like, I require all public constructors on the type arguments you pass in. But the problem is
that just generic type arguments, or does that also work with like arrays of like literal types? I guess is the question.
Actually, I don't know. I mean, usually like once you call a method that takes type, it's basically at that point it's just at the point you pass in literal information is lost, right? And then
yeah, I remember being impressed though by some of the stuff the linker was able to follow. I thought it was more than just the generic type arguments, but clearly generic type arguments would be the easiest. I
mean, for some definition of easiest, but yeah.
I mean, yeah, for the linker to kind of follow the usage, one would hope, because you can't, outside of reflection, introduce those at runtime. Yeah, so like I'd be willing to like tentatively approve this API on the assumption that there are some cases where you might not know at compile time what your extra argument types are. Like I'm guessing there are some scenarios there, but then also look at adding more type arguments for the argument types.
To be honest, I don't think it adds that much. But that's just me.
But I guess the question is, would you like, yeah, I think it adds enough that it makes sense that it's there. It's kind of a gap at the moment. Like it's true. Like if you're comparing create factory to create instance, like we can go further.
Like a slight convenience of not having to like, I think it's more of usability for what they requested than anything else based on what you also said. Right. So are you approving it as a func now?
I mean, I have to be honest, like I would probably rather do the generic. I'd rather do the adding a delegate, because I think it seems weird to go from Because if convenience is the goal, then I think this func is not going to be amazing, right? Because now you have to, if you take methods that take these things, now it's just like you have to type all the stuff out all the time, versus in the old world you just passed an object factory, which is much easier. And so I think you would want to go from object factory to object factory of t, and not having to deal with the service provider and the object array every single time.
I mean, is this a thing that is expected to get passed around or just stored as a field?
I mean, if you just look at the usage on ASP.NET, I mean, like, as soon as you pass it into a func of object factory, then it becomes really ugly, right? If you want to do some lazy initialization around these things, right? Which is, I think, what ends up happening.
It's generally a field, right? You're generally caching it if you're using this in some way or form. And yeah, like even as a field, I'm kind of inclined to like seeing it now, written all out, with the nullability annotation and all of that. It does look like a lot.
Fair enough. I mean, the pre-known signatures one. So it, to doodle it here, if we had, t arg1 t arg2 t ret.
Right. Then I think it would be more useful.
That would be func. Because
because you don't want to define a bunch of delegate types for each parity.
And it's because this is exactly what it's doing, right? It's I am giving you a thing. Given this triplet of things, I produce that. I am a very locked, tight argument. Like, because I will admit, like the object factory. This array is not flexible, right?
That's why
this defines how long the array has to be when you call it. It defines what types they have to be consistent with. So if we want to say object factory special because this array is special, like that's a great we need the documentation here of this is not any array. It's a typed array that has to meet the patterns of it's a weak array where each of the elements must be conform to the types that were specified in argument types, and that's enough of a reason if we want documentation on the type that it's worth having a type.
Yeah, I think in general, I think I like funcs when the signature is kind of self-evident, I guess. But as soon as you mix it with something else, which the service provider already does, it gets unfortunate. I think the second example you have here, I think, would be reasonable because we don't want to define 16 versions of that delegate clearly.
Yeah.
But I think, there is still the benefit of having a delegate if you can put, documentation on them and name them, right? And I think this is a bit, if it literally would just take a bunch of argument types and gives you back a func taking those arguments, I think this would be easier.
Because this is where we get
makes it difficult.
The weird thing of we're saying, object factory in the documentation that the object array is defined, it must match the shape that was provided by create factory, but it's a public type, so anybody could create an object factory. It's a delegate. It's just a signature pattern. It's like an interface. You can write down whatever you want in the docs, but it's not true in reality.
Yeah, sure. And
that's part of why when we added, generic func and generic action, it's like stop creating new delegates because they're all lies. They're all the same delegate. And so don't write down this delegate must have this behavior. It's like, no, the place you're passing it says it must have this behavior. It's a documentation for the calls or for the target or the thing that's producing it, not of the type itself. But sure, we can.
This is probably the biggest issue
Add
with
the
CLR.
delegate
The delegate types are not structured. But
right. They're like an interface. They're syntax with no semantics.
Yeah.
I'm worried about the line 10 because if we were to look at 100 existing usages of create factory today, it's just not known how how many of them are gonna have two arguments, one argument. I just like to have only one.
Oh, so we're not actually adding line 10. I'm gonna delete that before.
10 was just
that was a talking about.
Okay.
That's what this bullet
it was
point
to
of
explain.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't.
It was a case where we wouldn't stick with Object Factory, though. We decided we will stick with Object Factory because of the object array argument in this case.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And I agree, though, Miriam, that like the one argument version of the like iService provider TARG1 would probably be by far the most common and maybe even the only one we need.
Right. I mean, so then so the consider in the future is if you decide, we need like 1, 2, and 3. And why'd we add 3? Because we found people doing 2. Like, we didn't find anybody using 3, but we'll add it and we'll let people come back and complain for more. We certainly wouldn't say, well, Func supports up to 15, so let's go that far. It's like, only add the ones that make sense. So, I will delete this line, and we need to also add, we need to make the proposal compile. And I can delete all these because they're context, not content. All right. Any other feedback?
I like it.
Ship it.
Thank you.
I just hope that's not the implementation. Oh no, it seems unfortunate.
Yeah. It's DI. Who cares?
It's a very expensive way to not ref. Which, in fairness, seems to be the DI way of not referencing.
Expensively? Yeah.
Yes.
So much shade. All right. We're done, right?
Yep. And 11:59 is close enough to 12 that it's not worth talking about anything else. I guess before banging the gavel, I should check with chat. Comments about delegates with constructors, etc. But nothing seriously floating or influencing things. So thanks everyone for joining us, and the few people who joined the Teams version of the call. Thank you for joining us, so we had some semblance of quorum. And yeah, see people next week at the same .NET time on the same .NET channel.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye bye.
Bye, everyone.
Auf Wiedersehen.